Okay, thanks to Jim and Abner for having me discuss this paper. It was an interesting read, and I enjoyed it. The one caveat to my thank you is that when I agreed to discuss the paper, Abner did promise me good snow. So he still has yet to live up to that end of the bargain, but I'm hoping he's going to come through for me. He's working on it. Okay, so I want to try to do a couple things in my 15 minutes. The first one is just kind of summarize what's going on in the model. There are kind of a lot of ingredients and some interesting and complicated dynamics, so I'm going to try to summarize what's going on in the model. And then I want to kind of take a step back and ask a few questions about the motivation for this model, and encourage the authors to try to kind of sharpen what the real question, research question, they should be asking in the paper. And then I'll add a couple more, maybe more minor comments at the end. All right, so first of all, this is a very rich model. It's got a lot going on. It's a dynamic, continuous time, infinite horizon model where there's asymmetric information. So the worker and the intermediary know about the worker's type, but the client does not. It's got this feature of intermediation, which is kind of really the new bit, because we're familiar with dynamic models with adverse selection and learning. So the intermediation is kind of the new bit, but on top of that, there's also this learning, right? So the clients over time are going to observe signals about the worker's performance, and that's going to reduce the amount of asymmetric information between client and intermediary worker pair. Okay? Good, so what is the intermediary doing here? Well, the intermediary is really offering the worker's wages and choosing when to terminate them. And they do this a bit in a reduced form way in the model, where they just say, look, we're going to give the worker the minimum possible wage they need to stay with the firm and not exit. But what's kind of interesting is what that minimum wage is. It depends on both the worker's type and their past performance and what the clients currently perceive as the reputation of the worker that would exit the firm, which varies over time. Okay, so these wages are going to depend on the worker type and on their historical performance. The worker, what are they doing? They're not really doing all that much, but they're choosing basically when to exit. Okay, so the wage is set so that they're willing to work for the firm. And the only thing that the workers really do is when do they exit the industry. And this is actually the only decision of any economic significance. The rest is just redistributive. Okay, so this is what determines how the worker is allocated, whether they're allocated to the client or to another industry. Okay, so prior to the worker's exit, they're either employed by the firm and therefore working for the client, allocated to the client, or they contract directly with the client. Okay. And then what does the client do? Well, the client just pays her expected value for workers given her beliefs. Okay, and these beliefs are going to vary over time based on the worker's employment history, whether they're still with the intermediary or not, and based on her performance. Okay, and then as Dmitry said, this learning is going to take place. They consider two variants of the model. One where the learning takes place via a Poisson process. The NNGN means no news is good news. Okay, what does that mean? It means as long as you didn't have a negative outcome, beliefs are kind of drifting up about your type. Okay, and then if a shock comes, you had a bad outcome, well, now I know that you're an unskilled worker. Okay, and then they also consider a Brownian version, as Dmitry mentioned, which has a lot of the same characteristics, features in the equilibrium, as well as some additional ones. Okay, so first comment is this is a rich model. There's kind of a lot going on, and so I'm going to try to unpack what that is. What are the two kind of main takeaways that I got from reading the paper? The first one is this pay for reputation. Okay, and I think there's kind of two things going on in the pay for reputation, which Dmitry kind of helped me understand in his presentation. So workers are willing to accept a wage below what they could get if they go to the open market. And the reason that they're willing to do that is to avoid damage to their reputation today, but also because by staying with the intermediate, they anticipate it being built up faster. Okay, so there's kind of these two things that are working that allow the firm to extract from the worker. It's kind of the threat of firing you, but also the carrot of speeding up your building reputation by staying with me as the intermediary. Okay? And then the second kind of main result, can you move that cursor? The little arrow just kind of drives me crazy. Thanks. The second kind of main result is this churning finding, that the equilibrium is characterized by periods of churning. As the information asymmetry erodes, so does the intermediary's ability to extract these rents. And so what does the intermediary start doing? Well, it starts terminating the lowest ability workers and grabbing new ones. Okay, because there's more uncertainty about those new workers that it hires. And so it can start extracting rents again from those new workers. And I'm going to try to illustrate the intuition for this in kind of the simplest possible way in a few slides. Okay, this churning, to me, it felt very similar to the skimming that you see in the dynamic adverse selection literature, some of which I've worked on. Actually, the equation that pins down the rate of skimming is almost identical, but I actually think the economics are a little bit different. So I agree with the authors in saying that, this looks like, you look at the equation, you're like, wow, that's the exact same thing from Fuchs and Skirpich 2010, but I think the economics are a bit different. I'll try to explain why. Okay, so I think this is my favorite picture to kind of illustrate what's going on along a sample path. Okay, so this is an illustration of the reputation building dynamics along a sample path where there's no bad news. Okay, so as soon as bad news comes, we all know that you're an unskilled worker, you leave the industry, game over. Okay, so this is along a path where the agent has good performance. And what happens initially is, in that kind of early period from 0 to T star, is that the information asymmetry is high. So the intermediary can extract a lot of the rents from the agent. And so the intermediary retains all of the agents. Okay? So this is that expropriation period that Dmitry was talking about. Eventually at T star, the kind of wedge, and it's a little bit hard to see in my figure, but trust me, the wedge between belief of, so let me tell you what the QT is and the KT is, I guess, first. So QT is the belief that the client has for workers employed by the firm. Okay, so this is the average worker that stays with the intermediary. KT is the belief that the client would have if you left the firm, okay, on that date. Okay, and as this wedge sort of shrinks, you can think about the asymmetry as getting smaller, so does the profitability of trying to expropriate from these agents. And so what the intermediary starts doing is churning workers. Okay, that is letting go of the lowest type workers. And what that does is it makes this KT grow faster than this function pi here. This is the belief that you would have if there's no churning, but still good performance. Okay, so that red line starts to deviate from the dotted black one. Now we're in this churning region. And in addition, the blue line, which is the belief if you're employed with the firm, starts to increase above and beyond this pi of Q0T function. That's the belief you would have absent the churning. Okay? So that's kind of what's going on during this churning period. The red and the blue are getting closer together until they meet at T bar, at which point I can't expropriate anymore. There's no more ability to reputation build, and I just terminate any remaining workers. Okay? So that's kind of an illustration of the reputation dynamics. Okay, so now I want to take a step back and think about what the motivation for this paper is. And they start with this claim that it's sort of surprising that many workers possessing general industry skills don't just contract directly with clients and sell their services, especially in professions where performance is observable. And this just didn't strike me as the right motivation. First of all, I disagree. I don't think it's that surprising. If you could sort of rephrase the question, you could ask, well, why is it that law firms and accounting firms exist? And I started thinking about, well, could one single lawyer manage a multi-billion-dollar corporate lawsuit? Probably not, right? There's economic specialization. We need scale. I might be very good in the courtroom as a trial lawyer, but I might be horrible at writing appeals, so I've got to hire someone else to work with me. And once I hire someone else to work with me, and now we've got to coordinate our economic activity, we have lots of theories for the firm. And so I didn't view this as a very good theory for a firm. I think Coase gives us good reasons for theories of the firm. I think Alchin and Dempsitz give us good reasons for theories of the firm. By the way, they tell us that it's input that matters, that must be observable in order to avoid the free riding problem, not output, giving us sort of a monitoring rationale for the firm. So I don't really buy this motivation as here's why we see a firm. Okay, I think we need to think a little bit differently about how to motivate this paper. So I was trying to do that. And my first attempt at rephrasing the question was if you're in a, yeah, thank you. If you're in a pure adverse selection setting about quality, is there a role for an intermediary? And the answer is yes, and Lazari 99 gives us that answer. This is actually a very beautiful paper. I read it in grad school, and it inspired me to do theory. So let me walk you through what Lazari's answer was and how I think it kind of sheds some light on this question, but then also what happens if you go to a dynamic setting with learning as the authors do. Okay, and that'll be probably my last 5 minutes. Okay, so what happens in Lazari, and this is really an adaptation of Lazari. Lazari has a slightly more general problem that they're solving, but this is fitting it into the kind of set of questions that we're looking at. So we've got a worker that's got productivity T, uniformly distributed on 0, 1, and privately known by the worker. There's an intermediary who can observe T and offer wages to the worker. And then the worker can decide whether to work for the intermediary or contract directly with the firms. Okay? And firms are going to be competitive in the market. The firms are like the clients. The clients are competitive in the market for workers. Okay, and Lazari's main finding is that in the unique equilibrium, what happens is all workers are employed by the intermediary at a wage of 0. Okay? So workers accept this low wage in order to avoid a hit to their reputation, which would be that they're thought to be the lowest possible type if they don't work for the intermediary. Okay, so here is the expropriation, right? The intermediary is just capturing all of the rents from this transaction by threatening to fire the workers or not hire them at a very low wage. Okay? In this equilibrium, the intermediary is extracting all of the surplus here, which is a half. And by the way, there's no information being communicated to firms because the firm hires all the workers. Okay? So Lazari tells us that there is a role for an intermediary in a pure adverse selection setting. Now, there's no real economic role here. Yeah, thanks. But there is an equilibrium role. This intermediary is playing a function in this market and extracting surplus. Okay, so now I want to think about a dynamic version of Lazari, which is essentially what the authors are doing. Okay, so let me just suppose that in the second period, clients are going to learn whether your type is above or below a half. Okay, and now the intermediary can decide to retain the worker by offering a wage of 0 if you got the low signal, below a half, and a half if you got the good signal, because I know you're above a half. But what happens is now, because I've got to pay these guys with a good signal more, the profits shrink. Right now the client knows that some of these workers are actually pretty good. They're willing to pay more, so the outside option of the agent goes up, and the intermediary's profit shrinks. Okay? So this is, if you compress the amount of asymmetric information, you make the intermediary less profitable. And one thing the intermediary could do instead of retaining the workers is to fire the worker, replace them with a new one, and this is going to be optimal if the replacement cost is less than a quarter. Okay? Now here the A is kind of special. The A equal to a half is kind of special. It means that you get the same profit from retaining good and bad performers. If I change it so that A is bigger than a half, then actually now you have more incentive to fire the good performers because you've compressed the amount of asymmetric information at the top. Whereas if A is less than a half, then we get Ron and Dmitry's case where you have more incentive to fire the bad performers. And my takeaway from thinking through this is that it may also be optimal for firms to churn high ability types. Okay. And one example would be if the Poisson arrival actually reveals good news, well, at that point, there's no reason to retain strong ability workers because you can't extract anything from them. Okay, so I'm probably almost out of time, so let me just quickly mention 2 more comments. How much time do I have, Peter? 1 minute? Okay. I'm going to skip comment 2. I'll give that to the authors. My third comment, my second comment, this thing is really buggy, by the way. I noticed Dmitry was struggling with it too, is the authors sort of emphasize performance being observable. Okay? That's sort of a key feature of the environment, the settings that they're looking at. So one side question I had was, what happens if performance isn't observable? Do you just get like a static repetition of Lazari or kind of what's going on? So that might be kind of useful to flesh out a little bit. But then the second question that I have is, if performance is observable, then why don't agents contract directly on performance? Wouldn't that be a useful screening device? And wouldn't agents want to go directly to clients and say, here, I'm going to offer you this contract where I'm going to convince you I'm a strong type because I'm willing to contract on this performance that you're going to observe in the future. And might that cut out the role for an intermediary? Does a fully separating equilibrium without an intermediary exist if we can contract on long-term performance? So that's sort of a question. Now, I'm sure I'm out of time. So overall, this is an elegant model with a rich combination of ingredients. I think technically it's very impressive and surprisingly tractable, and I commend the authors on solving a hard problem. There's some subtle and interesting and novel dynamics. I wish I had more time to talk about them. What would I like to see in a revision, which I know they're working on? I'd like to see a little bit sharper motivation. I have another idea on the slides for you. I'd like to see a bit more relation to the existing literature. Lazari was actually not cited in the paper, which I think was kind of a shame. And I would like to see, this was my second comment, which I'll convey offline, a bit more of the economic implications, the allocation implications of this intermediation. You have some discussion on it, which I think is interesting, about modulating entry, and I'd like to see some of that formalized. All right, thanks.